The Dark Scrolls. The stories began in whispers, hushed voices behind decaying lattice screens, when the sun sank behind the citadel of Thang Long and the corridors turned black as ink. They said a curse older than the dynasty itself had wrapped its coils around the young emperor's heart, that no prayer nor offering could ever loosen it. In daylight, the royal court tried to dismiss such talk as the drivel of old widows and failed mandarins. But when night came, no one dared to approach the throne hall without a talisman tucked in their robe. He had not always been a man who drew horror from his own people. In the first years of his reign, he was merely indulgent, fond of wine, quick to laughter. But after the death of his closest advisers and the silent retreat of learned monks from the palace, something began to sour. Witnesses swore the emperor's face changed in the glow of the lanterns, his eyes swelling, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the irises whole, like ink bleeding across parchment. Some believed the ancestral spirits had been offended by his excesses, that their wrath had festered into a blight upon his flesh and mind. His banquets became rites, grotesque masquerades of pleasure, where the courtiers dared not refuse an invitation. The gongs thundered after nightfall, summoning noble families to the feasting hall. There, behind curtains embroidered with five-clawed dragons, they found the emperor on his lacquered dais, clothed in robes heavy as burial shrouds. The air smelled of rotting fruit and opium smoke. Servants in masks of lacquered jade crept between the guests, carrying cups filled to the rim with fermented liquors, red as fresh blood. No one spoke of policy, no decrees were signed. Instead, the emperor presided over these endless revelries, as if he drew life from watching others lose themselves to gluttony and debauchery. Some nights, music would stop without warning. A hush would fall, so profound that the very walls seemed to hold their breath. Then, from the shadows behind the dais, shapes would emerge, figures stooped under the weight of centuries. They were draped in robes that fluttered without wind, faces hidden behind death masks inlaid with tarnished silver. The emperor never flinched. Instead, he would rise, raise his cup, and toast the phantoms, as though he alone could see the faces beneath the masks. A woman who had once served as his nurse said she recognized one among them. The spectral shape of the first Tran emperor returned to watch his descendant squander the dynasty's glory. But she did not live long to tell that tale. She was found floating in the lotus pond the next dawn, her tongue bitten through. The imperial treasury, once rich with tribute and the harvests of the land, was drained as surely as if some invisible maw had swallowed it. Caravans brought casks of rare liquors from Champa, bolts of silk from Yuan lands, cages of exotic birds destined to die in the stifling air of the pleasure pavilions. The mandarins wrung their hands, scribbling petitions in the dead of night, but their pleas never reached the emperor. It was rumored that the scribes themselves fell under the same influence, an enchantment that dulled ambition, until all will to resist dissolved like wax in a furnace. As the months slithered by, the banquets grew stranger. Witnesses described rituals that defied sense, dancers smeared in ashes, chanting in tongues no one recognized, courtiers forced to drink from bowls carved out of human bone, the emperor daubing sigils of vermilion on his own skin before sinking into a stupor that lasted until dawn. When the guests finally staggered out, they swore they heard something pacing behind the silk screens, a slow, dragging gait, as though the ancestors themselves had come to watch and weep. And yet, no guard ever dared to intervene. No priest ventured past the threshold to break the cycle. Those who tried were said to vanish before their cries reached the outer courtyard. The fortress of Thang Long became a tomb in all but name. Outside its walls, the peasants spoke of a red lantern that burned all night atop the tallest tower, a sign that the emperor was once again lost to his infernal feast. Mothers hushed their children with threats that if they did not sleep, the lantern's glow would crawl into their dreams and claim them. The land itself began to sicken. Harvests failed. Floods returned year after year, black water rotting the rice in the paddies. Merchants closed their ledgers and fled south, murmuring that the dynasty was cursed. But the emperor did not emerge to quell their fears. He had become a creature of twilight, feeding his hunger on the coin and dignity of his kingdom, while the ancestral spirits grew more restless with every passing season. There were nights when the wind carried voices through the lacquered corridors. Sentries posted near the throne hall clamped their hands over their ears, but the voices seeped through flesh and bone. Lamentations, curses, fragments of old oaths. They spoke of the first emperors who had carved the nation out of blood and toil, now condemned to watch their line defiled by a single decadent heir. Some claimed the emperor answered those voices, his own words blurred with the slurred intonation of the drunk and the damned. A chronicler hiding in the roof beams wrote that he saw Tran Du Tong at the center of a final gathering, robed in garments stitched from funeral silks. His guests lay sprawled in drunken torpor around the dais. As dawn bled into the hall, the emperor lifted his cup to the void, and in that dim light the chronicler swore he glimpsed the faces of the dead assembled at his back, the founding kings, the generals who had broken the Mongol hosts, their hollow eyes fixed upon him in bottomless reproach. He did not flinch. He drank and drank again, until the wine streamed down his chin. It was said that in that moment he ceased to be merely human, that whatever curse had rooted in his veins had claimed him at last. When the chronicler dared look again, the emperor was gone. The dais stood empty, the cup overturned. The lanterns guttered into darkness. Outside the walls, the red lantern atop the tower flickered out for the first time in a decade. The people held their breath, hoping this marked the end of the nightmare. But the nightmares did not end. Those who had served in his court dreamed of him still, of his face, pallid and bloated, rising out of darkness to whisper that the dynasty's debts could never be paid. In the years that followed, no one spoke openly of Tran Du Tong. His name was scratched from certain records, and the chronicles of his reign were hidden in locked chests. But in every village, from the river deltas to the mountain passes, old women still warned children that a king's hunger could be the ruin of an empire. And on nights when the moon turned red behind clouds, some claimed they could see the lantern's glow rekindled atop the ruined tower, a trembling ember that refused to die. The sun never quite rose over Thang Long in the seasons that followed. Even at midday, the sky was a bruise of gray and purple, and the river that wound past the city walls seemed to carry the stench of decay. Those who dared to approach the old palace spoke of a hush so profound it crushed every footstep before it reached the ear. It was as though the fortress had been swallowed whole by the memory of the emperor's final nights. Yet despite the silence, signs remained that the rites continued in some hidden chamber. Courtiers who survived the last months of Tran Du Tong's reign whispered that a handful of the emperor's most trusted servants had never left his side. They wore robes stained darker than the lacquered pillars, and their faces were forever turned downward, as though they feared to meet the gaze of the living. Some said they were no longer wholly human, that the years of intoxication and blasphemous ceremony had transformed them into vessels for the same ancient curse. On moonless nights, shadows were seen moving between the shuttered halls, carrying offerings to a throne no man dared to approach. Servants claimed they glimpsed skeletal hands arranging incense sticks in bowls that had not been used since the founding of the dynasty. There were even tales of low chanting echoing from the innermost chambers, a droning cadence that seeped into the marrow and left listeners raving by dawn. The new regents dispatched emissaries to reclaim the palace. Each time they returned pale and mute. When pressed, they would only murmur that the emperor's presence had not dispersed, that he lingered in every corner, watching, waiting. Some petitioned for the entire compound to be razed and consecrated, but fear of offending the ancestral spirits was too great. Instead, the gates were sealed, the courtyard choked with weeds, and the palace was left to fester. Beyond the palace walls, rumors spread that Tran Du Tong's hunger had seeped into the soil. Villages nearest the capital began to fail. Entire hamlets awoke to find their granaries emptied overnight, though no doors were broken and no tracks marked the fields. The people believed the emperor's shade stalked the countryside, searching for the tribute that had once sated his bottomless thirst. Children born in those years were said to have the look of the dead in their eyes, and the old midwives refused to speak the emperor's name within earshot of newborns, lest the curse pass into fresh blood. In the southern provinces, monks gathered to debate whether such corruption could be purged. They pored over ancient sutras, searching for words potent enough to dissolve the bonds between the emperor's spirit and the living world. But no record offered reassurance. Every text agreed that a king who had invited the ancestors' wrath could never be fully exorcised. He became part of the dynasty's root, feeding on it, weakening it, until the entire trunk withered. Meanwhile, traders from Champa and Yuan, who once filled the markets with silk and porcelain, now avoided Thang Long altogether. When pressed for explanation, they only crossed themselves and recounted the same vision. A single lantern burning in the highest window of the abandoned tower, though the windows had been bricked up long before. It was always the same dim ember, pulsing like the last heartbeat of a dying god. The chronicler who had witnessed the emperor's final banquet never recovered from what he had seen. He sealed his journals in a lacquered chest and instructed that they be burned upon his death. But when the chest was opened decades later, the pages were still legible, though every line was streaked with ink that no scholar could erase. They told of one final horror that the chronicler had hidden even from himself. He wrote that on the last night, after the guests collapsed in stupor, the emperor had lifted his cup and whispered a litany. Each verse was a perversion of the prayers offered to the dynasty's founders. He called upon their spirits not for guidance, but for surrender. He promised them an empire of perpetual night, where no harvest would ever come, and no child would ever be born, unmarked by ruin. Then he raised the cup to his lips and vanished. The chronicler swore he heard a sound in the instant afterward, like an entire palace exhaling. The tapestries fluttered without wind, the lacquered pillars wept black resin. And in that single moment he saw every ancestor of the Tran line crowding behind the throne, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Some wept, some gnashed teeth that had rotted in their graves, but none of them lifted a hand to stop what was coming. When the chronicler dared to look again, the dais was empty. No corpse, no crown, no sign the emperor had ever existed beyond the hunger that now soaked every stone. And so the palace became a maw, a hollowed monument to gluttony and sacrilege. For years, no bird dared to settle on its eaves. No grass grew in its courtyards. Even the river, which had once nourished the city, curved away as though it, too, refused to touch the cursed foundations. Some claimed the emperor had not disappeared at all, but only slipped behind the thin veil that separates life from death. They believed he waited there still, listening for the names of those who dared to speak of him, eager to drag them into the same oblivion he now called his kingdom. In the villages beyond the walls, it became custom to hang talismans in every doorway, strips of mulberry paper inked with the names of older, nobler kings. Mothers told their children never to look too long at the palace ruins. If they did, they might see the lantern burning again, and the silhouette of the emperor, cup in hand, offering them a toast from the darkness. Years turned into decades, but the sickness in the land never truly receded. Even when a new emperor was enthroned and proclamations were issued to reassure the people that the old blight had been laid to rest, the soil remained thin, the harvests unreliable. Entire generations were born under a pall of unspoken dread, inheriting the fear like a family heirloom. It was said that when the monsoon winds shifted, they carried with them a bitter perfume, wine gone sour, old incense clinging to cold stone. That was when the elders locked their gates and the monks doubled their prayers, for those nights were believed to be the moments when the emperor's spirit returned to walk the corridors, measuring the emptiness he had left behind. The stories grew stranger with each telling. Some insisted the emperor no longer had a face, that he had bartered it away to whatever darkness had promised him immortality. Others swore they had seen him, pale and robed in funeral silk, drifting between the pillars of the ruined hall. They said his mouth moved as if in prayer, though no voice ever emerged, and his cup was never empty. Few dared to enter the old palace. The rare souls who did, treasure seekers, fortune tellers, drunk soldiers trying to prove their courage, never returned unchanged. Those who stumbled out again were gray-haired, slack-jawed, their eyes forever fixed on some point just beyond the horizon. When pressed, they spoke in broken fragments of visions too grotesque to understand. Processions of rotting kings, dancers whose limbs ended in blackened stumps, a feast where the guests devoured their own hearts in ecstatic silence. One night, an old woman known for her gift of prophecy was persuaded to cross the threshold. She went alone, clutching a lacquered tablet inscribed with the oldest prayers of the dynasty. It was dawn before she returned. Her hands were raw from crawling, and her eyes were so bloodshot they looked as though they might burst. She collapsed on the stones, whispering that the emperor had spoken to her, not with words, but with a single thought pressed into her mind until it nearly split her skull apart. No hunger ever ends. Then she died, her body twisting as though she were still trying to crawl away. The regents, desperate to cleanse the taint, ordered the palace sealed with bricks and iron. They decreed no soul should ever cross its threshold again. But the walls were old, and time is patient. Cracks opened in the mortar. Strange lights flickered behind the slats of shuttered windows, and the red lantern, which the people had prayed never to see again, returned one night, gleaming in the darkness like a single bloodshot eye. Even the imperial scribes, men trained to chronicle without embellishment, could not bear to write plainly of those years. The official annals called it a period of prolonged decline. But in the villages, among farmers and fishermen, they called it by a truer name, the emperor's last feast. One legend claimed that on certain nights, if the moon was hidden and the river lay still as black glass, the emperor's cup would appear on the palace steps, brimming with a liquor no living hand had poured. Woe to the fool who dared touch it, for it was said that whoever drank would taste not wine, but the sum of all the empire's debts. Every sin unatoned, every hunger unappeased, every prayer left to rot in the dark. And still the hunger grew. Generations passed, yet the stories never faded. A child born beneath the palace's shadow would sometimes wake screaming, claiming he had dreamed of a banquet that never ended, where the guests were dead but did not know it. They would say the emperor himself had beckoned them closer, his hand pale as a withered lotus, inviting them to sit and partake. When the dynasty at last collapsed and new rulers claimed Thang Long, they found the palace exactly as it had been left. The throne draped in cobwebs, the dais cracked by time, the air so thick with the scent of ancient offerings that even the bravest soldiers gagged behind their masks. Yet no sign remained of the emperor's body. no crown or scepter, no bones to bury. It was as though he had become smoke or had slipped into the marrow of the building itself. One chronicler, braver or more foolish than the rest, insisted on spending a single night within the throne hall to record his observations. In the morning, his companions found him crouched by the dais, scribbling furiously. His hair had turned white as frost. When they pulled the parchment from his hand, they saw only a single sentence repeated over and over in jagged, bleeding script. He is still here. Even now, in a modern world that believes itself immune to superstition, the story endures. Guides who lead tourists past the ruins speak in hushed tones, never quite meeting the listener's eyes. They say that on certain nights, the red lantern still ignites, a pulse of dull fire behind the shattered windows. If you watch too long, you will see him there, no longer a man, no longer even a king, but the embodiment of a hunger that outlived the dynasty itself. And some say that if you are very unlucky, if your heart carries too much greed or secret longing, he will lift his cup in silent invitation. He will show you the banquet hall as it once was, the jeweled goblets, the perfumed dancers, the silken drapes blackened by centuries. He will whisper that all you desire can be yours if you only sit at his table and surrender your name to the darkness. No one knows what happens to those who accept. But every generation, a few souls vanish without trace, merchants, scholars, wandering dreamers. And the old women of Thong Long shake their heads, certain that the emperor has found new guests to join his endless feast. And so the hunger endures, hidden behind stone and legend, waiting for the next unwary heart to answer the call. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.